This interview is going to shock you, even if you think you couldn't possibly be shocked anymore about Israel's genocide in Gaza. I'm going to speak to this incredible doctor. He's a British-Australian doctor of Palestinian heritage. He's been there in Gaza working in apocalyptic conditions. And, you know, I'm here at Cafe Palestina. Do go, by the way, it's in North London. And we're going to talk here about what's actually happening, the horrors being unleashed with the complicity of our government, which is helping to facilitate this genocide. And what we're going to talk about is just so beyond description. And he talks so brilliantly and eloquently. We have to hear this. He's also got ideas about what can be done. If you're feeling helpless and you've just given up, this interview is so important. So please listen as best you can. So no, I mean, you're a British-Australian doctor of Palestinian heritage. I guess that's, I don't know, one way of describing, I guess, your identity, heritage. Just before I ask you about Gaza, I mean, why did you become a doctor?
Well, my dad's a doctor, and my dad was born in the refugee camps of Gaza. As a matter of fact, actually, his clothes that he used to wear a sack, and it was a USAID flour bag, and he used to cut holes in it, and that was his trousers. It's knowing the poverty that he came from, and knowing that education was the key to get out of that poverty. And he became a doctor. He was educated in Egypt. He's now one of the leading fertility specialists in the UK. And I used to watch him every day when I was a kid, going to work. I used to see what he was able to do for our family. And I was also to see how he was able to uplift other people out of poverty as well. And it was medicine that did that. So that was one of the big reasons why I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a doctor because I wanted to just be like my dad.
Genocide began about 21 months ago. At what point in that time did you think, I'm going to have to go to Gaza?
The first 24 days of that war, 1,900 children were killed in the first 24 days. If anybody had been following the pro-Palestine movement or knew anything about the area and the region, everybody knows that there was a genocide that was always going to happen. And it was just a matter of when, not if. And I think it was evident when you killed 2,000 children in about 20 days. I think everybody knew what was coming next, but I don't think anybody expected it to go on for as long as it did. I think naively, I still had a bit of faith in the world that it would stop this, and obviously they didn't. So, from the very first moments when you saw what was going on, I knew I needed to be there to help.
I mean, from the very beginning, Israeli leaders and officials made genocidal statements of genocidal and criminal intent, by which I mean they abandoned any pretense of demarcation between civilians and what they would judge to be military targets. One example was the general in charge of Kogat, General Ghassan Alian, on the 9th of October 2023, and he said, I can't remember, this is almost exactly what he said, just so we're clear. He said, Hamas has become like ISIS, and the civilians of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human beasts will be dealt with accordingly. He said there will be no water, no energy, only damage. You wanted hell, you will get hell. And that was in a tweet from Kogat, supposedly the IDF civilian wing, addressed to Hamas and the residents of Gaza. As a doctor, I mean, just hearing that, when it's very clear from the beginning that they saw the civilian population as being fair targets. What makes you, as a doctor, how do you respond to that in terms of what that actually means?
I mean, there's not really much that you can say to that. And they've been doing this, for generations. And, my family has been getting killed for generations. I remember when, just my family alone, 13 family members were killed in one go. This was before this war. And they were treated like animals then. They were treated inhumane then. And, so when he says this, to the world, it's shocking. But if you're a Palestinian, if you've got family in Gaza, it's not shocking. This is the language that was used almost on a daily basis. For generations, this is what it is. And for a generation, they've cut off, for 20 years, Gaza's been under siege. David Cameron called it the world's largest open-air prison in 2012.
We do.
Right? So, them saying they're cutting off electricity, they already only give electricity for a few hours a day anyway for the last 20 years. cut off fuel. They cut off fuel, I think, for 2 years between 2009 and 2011.
And the water was not fit for human consumption.
Yeah, 60% of the children in Gaza before the war were malnutrition. So there's already starvation there. 70% of the kids had PTSD. So, you know, when he says this, yeah, it might be shocking to some people, but if you know anything about the region and you've been there and you have family there, you know, for me, when I was listening to this, I was thinking, yeah, it's the same old rhetoric. They're going to kill a lot of children, like they always do. But I didn't realize the extent of what was going to happen. And obviously, you know, we can see what's happening today, 600 odd days later.
First time you went to Gaza, June 2024.
Yeah.
I mean, firstly, how did it feel going to Gaza the first time as someone who is Palestinian with so much of your family's in Gaza? How did that feel, that moment that you go to Gaza for the first time, and that was after, what, 9 months already of daily genocidal depravity? What was the first emotion as you crossed in?
I'm home. That was the first thing I thought of, you know, as soon as I walked in, even though it was just destroyed and rubble everywhere, and, you know, there were dead bodies on the floor near aid bags in militarized zone. People had been trying to get to aid, and they'd been shot and sniped while they were trying to get some of the aid that had fallen off these aid trucks. It was very confronting, because these are my people, and you don't know if some of these are your family members on the floor dead like that. And I remember when we first came in and we arrived at the European hospital, and the ambulances had arrived and they brought in an entire family that had been killed. And the first thing we did was we went to the mall to help identify these bodies. You know, we were bringing families in and we were opening up these body bags, and the family were coming in trying to identify these corpses with missing heads, fully burnt, limbs missing, children. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, we're here. It's not on your screen anymore. This is real now. We're really in Gaza. And, you know, at the time at the hospital, there was like 10,000, 15,000 people camping on the hospital grounds because of everyone had been displaced. So, you know, you really got a sense of like, we're in a total disaster place here.
And what always strikes me is when I talk to people who've been to Gaza since the genocide began is, as you mentioned, no matter how much you've seen on your screens, and this is the world's first live stream genocide, as it's often described, you can't actually understand. It's so much worse when you see the reality in front of you. I mean, how would you explain, because you would have spent, before you went, so much time, I know, just being aware of what was already happening for those 9 months. How much was it in terms of, did that actually not prepare you maybe for what you had to see?
Sure, it was hard for me because sometimes some of those kids that came in to the hospitals had my last surname. They were my family. And I was treating family members in Gaza.
And you only found out as soon as they arrived in?
You know, sometimes it's hard not to talk about it because I don't really talk about this much before, because I don't want to make this about me.
No, but also here the human.
But you know, when you have, I remember my first mass casualty event, and I remember when they, you know, there was a playground that was hit with a drone, and they brought in about a dozen children's bodies, and they all got them in blankets. Some of them alive, some of them were dead. And you know what you do in these mass casualty events, you just start opening up the blankets and you see who's alive, who's dead, and you see what you can do. And I remember the first blanket that I opened up, and it was a child with half his head missing, and his brain matter was out, and it was, you know, as you pulled the blanket, it pulled part of his brain with it. And I remember just freezing, and my hand was shaking. You know, I'm a grown man, but when you see a child's body so mutilated, when you see the brains hanging out, when you see intestines hanging out, when you see the bones sticking out, when you see 60% body burns, when you can smell burnt flesh of a child, it's just, it's confronting. And for me, what really got to me was I was just, it was a moment where I was scared, because I was like, what type of violence does this to a child? And we're here, we can hear the bombs going off outside. We're inside, and the violence going on out there did this to a child. And I'm just thinking to myself, how many more children like this? And I was thinking to myself, are we going to get out of here alive? Like if you're doing this to a child, if you're mutilating a child like this, what about the rest of us? So,
and an estimated 1,400 plus Palestinian medics have been killed.
Have been killed, yeah. and international aid workers.
Yeah, on top of that as well.
Yeah. So
The biggest killing of aid workers ever recorded.
yeah, and journalists, and just the statistics of all the things that you see in Gaza. When you're there and you're seeing it on the ground, when you're there and they burn the journalist tents outside the hospital where you are, and these journalists are brought into your hospital, and they are burnt alive. These journalists. Do you know? Piers Morgan always talks about a moral quandary he has. For months he was always at a moral quandary. When you're there, there's no moral quandary here. When you see the death of journalists, doctors, nurses, children, women, pregnant women, leaving babies in incubators to rot to death, it's not a moral quandary. It's a moral travesty.
You're a trained doctor. You're trained to deal with terrible horrors, and kind of to try and save people who've gone through all sorts of different traumas. A UN report, well, this is one example, last year said that Israel was deliberately and systematically destroying the healthcare system of Gaza, and they said this was part of the war crime of extermination. The crime against humanity, sorry, extermination. They've attacked every single hospital in Gaza. Most aren't functional. Those that remain are barely functional. They killed so many medics. They kidnapped so many medics, including one who's believed to have been raped to death with rifles.
Dr. Adnan.
Can you just explain what it's like working in those circumstances?
When I was working in the north, the hospital in the emergency department didn't have a single ventilator. When I was there last year at the European hospital, the sutures that we had stated on them not suitable for humans. We were suturing children with sutures that weren't suitable for humans, which meant that you'd have to pinch the skin 5 or 6 times just to break the skin. And you're dealing with these huge wounds, and these are the sutures that you've got. We had essentially almost little to no morphine at all. And we're coming in, people are coming in with legs blown off. We had people with parts of their face missing and still alive. People with 60% body burns all the way down to their bones. No analgesia, no painkillers. That's what you're working with in Gaza. Then, when you go to the ICU, you go to the radiology unit and you find bullet holes in CT scanners. Then you find the cords of ultrasound machines have been cut. I mean, this isn't, wasn't any militants hiding inside a wire, an ultrasound cable wire. But that's what happens. That's what goes on in Gaza. So, I wouldn't even call it a healthcare system anymore. It's essentially a partially standing building with a first aid kit.
Well, I mean, as a doctor, again, part of your training is you understand you're going to lose some of the people that you try and treat, and that's just the way things are. But in normal circumstances, you can think to yourself, I did everything I could, we did everything we could, but we had the medicine, we had the machines, all the rest of it. But in this case, you must have constantly been seeing people die in front of you who would have survived if there was a functioning healthcare system.
I mean, even put that to one side, I've never seen children being brought in with bread in their mouth. You know what I mean? Like these children are being killed while they're eating. Now you can see, a traumatic event, you can see a car crash, and you can see pretty, damaged human bodies when you work in the emergency department. But to see children with food in their hands, to see children who are stick-thinned because they've been starved, to see children who are jaundiced and yellow, that have liver failure because of the dirty drinking water, that's different. It's a different type of trauma that you're seeing. It's a different type of patient that you're seeing. So yeah, you might be used to seeing blood and gore as a doctor, but what you're not used to seeing is you're not used to seeing children like this.
Just on that, the New York Times, and I will say this as a journalist, the vast majority of the Western media, their reporting has been beyond the travesty. It's the biggest scandal in Western journalism in our time, in terms of how the genocide has been portrayed. But even the New York Times, let's put it that way, they had a feature which was based on the testimonies of dozens of US-based medics who'd served in Gaza, who testified that Palestinian children in Gaza were being sniper shotted in the head and in the chest, including twice, multiple times. And, point made by one of your colleagues is that no one gets sniper shotted by accident twice in the head. That doesn't happen. A British former soldier called Andrew Fox, who is a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, which is a very right-wing organisation, let's put it that way. And he writes reports which try to discredit the official death toll, which we know based on actual academic studies is a drastic underestimate.
Yes, it is.
He posted about the x-rays of these children which were accompanied the New York Times, which had to then, by the way, publish a follow-up just explaining, because they came under such attack, and explaining that, you know, because the truth was saying this is fake, and they had to go through, we've seen all, this is the evidence, blah, blah, blah. Now, he posted one of the x-rays of one of the children with a bullet through the head, and he made a joke about it. He said, posthumous x-ray of Sinwar just released. Of course, he's talking there about just so everyone knows, Sinwar there, he's talking about the former Hamas leader, but he's joking. And then when challenged, he claimed that this was faked. This isn't a real, this is not. What do you say, what would you say to this man who is on British media and treated as a credible and knowledgeable expert?
Well, I think this just goes to show you why this is happening. The fact that he can put up a picture of a child with a bullet through his head and joke about it is the problem, is why we're here. We've dehumanized these people so much that we can joke about their dead children, and not just their dead children, their children that have been executed, because that's an execution. A bullet that's pointing downwards, it only comes from one place, because remember, all the buildings are destroyed in Gaza. That's a drone. That's a quadcopter drone that circles overhead, points the gun down, and with its AI technology, it knows exactly, its targeting system, it knows exactly who's there, and that aimed at that child's head, and that shot that bullet. That's why it's a downward trajectory. There's no buildings in Gaza, no snipers on 20-story buildings shooting people. These are drones. These are man-operated drones that are shooting children like this. And he's not the only one to see, that picture is not the only one. We've seen it when we were there. I've had colleagues that went to Gaza before me and after me who've seen the exact same x-rays and the exact same images of children coming in with a bullet, an execution, a single gunshot wound execution. They're executing children.
So what do you say to those who say, when, obviously based on overwhelming evidence, the claim is that Palestinian children in Gaza have been deliberately shot in the head and or chest by the Israeli military, and then the response is, this is a blood libel, how dare you smear the Israeli military, the most moral army in the world. What do you say to them when people deny that, based on your experiences, that children aren't just being blown apart by missiles, they're being shot in the head and the chest deliberately?
Well, first of all, I'd say I was on the ground and I saw this with my eyes. I've got pictures, I've got video footage to show that. But you put all that to one side. I think at this stage, when people are denying what's going on in Gaza, when there's so many video evidence, there's so many pictures, and not just videos and evidence, there's so many eyewitness testimonies, there's international human rights organizations, including Israeli human rights organizations. When there's former Israeli prime ministers and heads of security intelligence agencies all saying that war crimes are happening in Gaza, right? I don't need to argue with someone who denies it, because there's plenty of people on every side, on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, who are all saying the same thing, which is war crimes are happening and children are being killed. So, to me, I think we're beyond the stage of arguing with these people. I think we're even beyond the stage of having a reasonable conversation with these people. We're it's like arguing with someone who's saying, what's 1 + 1? And they say it's 3.
Except this is a matter of life and death, death on a mass scale. This is life and death. You were there last June in 2024, and during that time, there was a so-called hostage rescue by the Israeli military. And just so everyone's aware, far more Israeli hostages have been killed by the Israeli military than have been rescued by military means. The only way that you've got significant releases of Israeli hostages is because those overwhelmingly we should regard as Palestinian hostages have also been released as part of a ceasefire agreement. But there was these three hostages, I think, 4 hostages, I do apologise. But And this was celebrated as a massive success.
Yeah.
A huge number
Yeah.
of Palestinian civilians were killed during that.
Yeah.
What do you think that, because you were there when that happened. So just tell me about the consequences. And when you were here, that's, you know, the way I suppose that really just exposes
Yeah.
the hierarchy of death. Not that, I mean, everything does, but that whose lives matter and that Palestinian life is treated as having no real meaning at all, actually.
Oh, no, over 1,400 people were dead and injured in the space of a couple of hours of this rescue operation. And I was there when all this mass casualty event, when these people were arriving, children being brought in from under the rubble. Now I remember, we didn't even have painkillers, but I remember we had this one guy who was in the middle of the ER and his jaw was missing. Half his face was missing, right? We didn't even have painkillers for him. And, you're just looking around. We had guys with part of their arms missing. We had children bleeding out to death on the floor. We had women with 60 to 80% body burns. This was just, these were the bodies that were coming in from this rescue operation. And, I had with me a Jordanian doctor called Dr. Mo as well. And he's an anesthetist. And I just said to him, I was like, what are we going to do here? I said, these people are screaming in pain and we've got no painkillers. We don't have enough ventilators for them. And I'm struggling here to watch children crying because of the pain and screaming because of the pain. Children who are left alone because they're orphaned there in the corner. And we can't even comfort them because there are people actively dying right now. So to me, I was, you're there and, when we got back to our room that night and, you're flicking on these BBC and CNN and they're going this, rescue mission. And I'm like, who's rescue? I'm here in a hospital full of women and children who have got some of the most horrific injuries and burns and no painkillers. And we're talking about this like it's a success. What about their lives? Do their lives not matter? And the crazy thing is that man with half a face missing, he was there for about 24 hours in the emergency department with half his face missing. And the only thing that I could really do for him was I had brought in with me some long-acting local anesthetic and some short-acting one, and I put it in a syringe. And, we moved some of the hanging meat on his face, and I put in a local anesthetic block in his face just to numb the side of his face. It was a dental block. That's all we could do for him, half his face missing, and that's all I could do. And I'd come back every few hours to refill that dental block for him. And I remember just thinking to myself, like, where's the humanity in this? Do you know what I mean? They wouldn't even let in, when we were there, they wouldn't let in a maxillofacial surgeon. So we didn't even have access to somebody who could do something about this. So, when we talk about that incident, that rescuing of the 4 hostages, all I can think about is just a ward full of dead women and children and body pieces everywhere.
You've been there twice and just witnessed the sorts of traumas that the vast majority of people are never, I would hope, ever going to experience, even a fraction of it.
Yeah.
There are Palestinian doctors who've been there all the way through. Their family members have been killed. Their colleagues have been slaughtered.
Yeah.
How are they coping? How are Palestinian doctors and nurses and medics coping in those circumstances?
Look, I mean, they're total heroes for what they do. And I remember when we had that, the break in the ceasefire, this particular time round, right? And, we were obviously underprepared, understaffed. There was only 3 doctors on in the ER and the international doctors. And, we were overwhelmed with bodies that came in after the ceasefire broke. And within about an hour, 2 hours, you started seeing doctors and nurses arriving into the hospital. They'd come in the middle of the night, drones overhead, to come and help because they knew that we would be overwhelmed. Now, they do this almost every single day on these mass casualties when they happen, where they come in and sometimes they have to walk through militarized zones where drones are overhead and it's a kill zone, and they're coming into the hospital to save people's lives. To me, I remember because we were struggling that day. We were struggling that night really hard. I mean, the images are on my Instagram. We were really struggling. And I remember just looking up because there were so many bodies that it was just on the street leading up to the hospital, on the hospital grounds. That was just full of bodies. And I remember I was doing these fast scans on these kids on the floor and people were screaming. And, you know, people were grabbing me, you need to see my child, you need to see my family. And, you know, because there's only a few of us. And I remember just looking up and I saw a couple of the ER doctors and they just said to me, Hamada, إحنا هون, like, we're here. Like, relax, you're okay. I remember just thinking to myself, wow, like, you know, their first concern was to come over and just comfort me because they knew of the stress of the situation and what we were dealing with. And they knew that they needed, you know, that they needed us. So, you know, when we talk about people who are, you know, that's why, like, I feel like I feel like an imposter, you know, when people come and they come up to you and they say you're a hero for going to Gaza or helping that. I'm just like, no, these guys, these doctors and nurses, they're the heroes. You know, I'm just here to tell their story.
A narrative we've often heard to justify what is in practice the mass slaughter of civilians is so-called human shields.
Yeah.
And a term which you never get it actually unpacked.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really striking, actually last year, not this time, but when there was Iranian missiles which towards Israel, and a CNN anchor said, well, you know, this is, you know, I'm just near Mossad, the headquarters, and there's so many around it civilian infrastructure, there's a real danger of them being injured or killed. I just thought, you know, if that was Gaza, then they would describe that as human shields. I mean, you know, and in practice, we know the Israeli army uses actual human shields in Gaza on an industrial scale. There's one example of a 8-year-old Palestinian man, this was reported in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, a explosive cord tied around his neck, made to go into homes to check for booby traps. Told if he didn't comply, they'd detonate the cord and decapitate him. Did that for hours, and then said to him and his elderly wife, you've got to go and flee on foot. And within minutes, they were both shot dead. That's a human shield. When you hear this discourse about human shields, and that's why doctors like yourself have to deal with the horrors that you're seeing, what do you say to that kind of idea of human shields?
What about those paramedics that were executed and buried in shallow graves? You know, what about when a family are walking through a marketplace and the youngest child is shot in the head? The youngest child, not any of the other children, not the father, not the mother, that's the youngest child, singled out like that. Why is it that they're able to kill Hamas leaders in Iran and in Tehran, and they're able to take out the entire Hezbollah leadership, right? But in Gaza, they have someone that they believe is hiding in or amongst the tents, and they have to drop a 2,000-pound bomb on tents. It's no longer human shields anymore. You know, it's intentional. And also as well, you know, if you step back and the analogy is like, well, what if, you know, you have these gunmen that go into schools in America and start shooting down children? Do we blow up the whole school to get that one gunman? No one would ever accept that as justifiable. But yet, when it comes to Palestinian lives, it's okay to kill 500, 400 people. It's okay to destroy an entire hospital. It's okay to leave children to rot in incubators, premature babies to rot in incubators, while you look for this military base in the hospital, while you force doctors and nurses to leave the ward at gunpoint and leave those children to rot in incubators. Where's the human shields in that? You know, and this is why, again, you know, the narrative and the conversation has to shift, because it's no longer valid. We've seen too many images. We've seen, you know, the mask has fallen off, Pandora's box is open. The whole world can see now what's going on. And, you know, this whole human shields thing, it doesn't fly anymore.
I mean, when you look, lots of us feel like we're going out of our mind when we watch Western media coverage, and I work in Western media. What's the kind of, how do you feel kind of the way the Western media portrays this versus what you have actually seen and the things that really hit you about this is just so dishonest?
Do you know, when they say the Hamas run health ministry, right? Yeah. I'm like, what about all those British doctors that are there? Are we working in the Hamas run health ministry? Are we working for a terrorist organization? We're there working and serving the civilians of Gaza, working in these hospitals, looking after women and children, right? When we count the dead bodies, it's us that are counting the dead bodies, right? We're not given orders by the Hamas run health ministry. We're not told that we're not allowed to go in this room or that room. We have open access to the whole hospitals. So, you know, again, it's this constant, like, you know, implication you know, that somehow like all of us are just lying. It's all conspiracy, but we're not allowed journalists into Gaza. And then the doctors, the foreign doctors that are going into Gaza, are coming out with all the same stories. But then on TV, it's just a complete disconnect from what we're seeing, what we're being told, and they're telling us something completely different.
So when you hear, for example, these claims made by the Israeli military, which are amplified by the Western media, which are that hospitals have been used as military bases, which is why their civilian status has been compromised and they become legitimate targets.
Right.
I mean, for base of what you know, this claim, they're being used as military headquarters by Hamas.
Look, a couple of things. It's ridiculous if they were being used as military bases, because one, all the media are there, all the cameras are rolling in the hospitals and outside the hospitals, because what happens is the media set up where the ambulances come in to film all the dead bodies that are coming in. These are the images that you see all the time. Ambulances coming in and people being pulled out of ambulances, right? If you were to have a military headquarters there, you're on TV almost all the time. And not just that, when we're international doctors, we're allowed to roam free in the hospital all the time.
So you think if that was happening, you'd be stopped? They go, no, don't go into this door. This door's off limits.
Well, but the other thing is, you know, I can't definitively say that for sure, because I wasn't going around inspecting the hospital. What I can say is when I was there working in the hospital, we didn't see anything. And, you know, if we saw people with guns in the hospital, that would be our danger. That would be our lives compromised. We would be in danger.
Yeah, of course.
And what it says is it also implies this complicity that us as Western doctors, that we wouldn't be there reporting this and saying, hey, listen, guys, you know, we need to evacuate some of these children from these areas because people are firing rockets from here, or there's men with machine guns.
You're putting these kids at risk.
And that's my concern.
Yeah,
my concern is the patient.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Whatever people want to do and whatever arguments they have and whatever military operation, that's not my concern. My concern is the children. So I'll always prioritize their safety first. And, you know, that's the thing with this whole like hospitals as being used as military, because they say the hospitals are, the mosques are. The Israeli ambassador to the UK said every other home had a tunnel in it. And, you know, they've destroyed 91% of the homes, all the hospitals, destroyed most of the mosques, bombed the church in Gaza, bombed the water desalination plants. You know, it gets to a point where you just think to yourself, like, you know, these Hamas guys, there were 30,000 members or something like that before, but you've destroyed over 200,000 buildings. Even if one of them had 7 buildings each. You know what I mean? It's just, to me, the maths isn't maths and the numbers don't make sense, you know? And when we talk about human shields, I'm just like going, that's a lot of children, you know what I mean, that are killed for human shields. That's a lot of children that are limitless. And if that's the case, get the media, get the Western media into Gaza, let them see what's going on, let them film these human shields, and then show the world the truth.
The official death toll is around 56,000.
Yeah.
How much of an underestimate do you think that is?
There's no heavy machinery in Gaza. You know, when I was walking from the hospital to the safe house, we would walk, you know, it'd be a 20-minute walk. And as we were walking, you would see these collapsed buildings. And, you know, some of the local doctors would you know, walk us back to the safe house. And, you know, they would just tell us, they would say, this is a family home. There's 30 people stuck under this. I was like, when was it bombed? They were like 9 months ago. So like, there's 30 people stuck under.
And they're not in the death. They're not.
It's not his death toll. They're not in the death toll. And then you've also got to remember, like, when the bombings are happening, if your family is dead, you don't need to go to the hospital to get a doctor to say, yeah, they're dead. You're picking them up in literal plastic bags. So what families do is they just bury them, because it's one, they can't afford to pay to put them on the back of a donkey cart or pay for a car to drive them to the hospital for a doctor to say, yeah, your children in plastic bags are all dead. So they don't even go, they don't even bother, because it's so common. Families lose so many family members that they just bury them at home. They don't get counted either. So, you know,
and the reporting mechanism, I guess,
the reporting mechanism is almost destroyed.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you get it, when we get, you know, when we get these bodies that come in, the way that they're counted, you know, they're checked by multiple people, multiple doctors, and there's multiple aid agencies that also are there checking these numbers on the ground. And there's a very vigorous process, because remember, every single Palestinian in Gaza has an ID number.
Yeah.
You know, and it has to be corroborated and matched with their IDs, and they have to be identified by family members. And, you know, and some of these injuries, you know, when we're talking about 80% body burns, it's very hard to recognize, you know, family members, and it's very hard sometimes to verify who it is. Because sometimes a whole family could be killed, and we don't know how many people are even under the rubble because the whole family's dead. We don't have a count. If somebody survives, they'll say, There was 30 of us in the house, and if only 10 are pulled out, we know 20 are still under the rubble.
I mean, we often people focus on the direct violence that kills people, bullets, mortar, bombs, missiles, all the rest of it. Also speak to Palestinians all the time in Gaza who so many of their family members have been killed, but so many, they'll talk about a younger son who was on dialysis before he's died because he can't get a dialysis machine. People who have cancer, or diabetes, heart problems. And then there's the hunger, lack of fresh water, lack of shelter, those sorts of things. How big do you think, the indirect deaths? Because we know from other wars, conflicts, whatever, which are less intense than this, that the biggest killers are actually indirect causes, not direct causes.
Well, the Lancet report, which is one of the most respected medical journals, is saying that it's anything between, 130 to 300,000 deaths. And, we would see children coming in with type 1 diabetes, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds. And because they hadn't had their insulin, they would go into diabetic ketoacidosis, they'd go into a coma and they would die. We were seeing children, Jim is 10 and 15 years old, having heart attacks. I was there for about, 5 weeks this particular time around. When I came out, I have grey hairs. Never had grey hairs before. I've got grey hairs. We've seen children with grey hairs, young children, 5, 6 years old with grey hairs. When we're talking about the indirect deaths, it's not just the deaths, it's the psychological trauma as well. This population is severely traumatized and will be for generations.
As I said, you've got family there.
Yeah.
You met some of that family for the first time while you were there.
Yeah.
You tell me about that.
Do you know, the first time I was there, when I was working at Nassau Hospital, you get almost 2,000 presentations a day. To put it in perspective, some of the busiest hospitals here in the UK would have less than 500. So you'd have 2,000 and you'd have little to no staff. I remember while I was working at the front, I was triaging people as they were coming in, and I got a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around, and I didn't recognize who it was because obviously I've never met my cousins before, my cousins. And he just looked at me, I looked at him, and then he just hugged me, and we just hugged in the middle of the emergency department at NASA for about 2 minutes. And, tear came down, I was crying. It was almost really this poetic Palestinian moment, right? Because as Palestinians, you almost live between hope and despair. And there was this hope that we were finally united as a family, but the despair of everything going on around us, that you were having women and children screaming, people bleeding to death, people collapsing and taking their last breaths. And there we were finally reunited. And it motivated me. It told me that this is why we're here. This is why we're fighting. We're fighting for these moments. We're fighting for these moments of family, of unity, of miracles. This is the first time I'm meeting my family, and the first time I'm meeting them there is because of the war. It's brought us together. So, it was a difficult moment, but it was also it was one of the best moments I've ever had in my life, because it was just such a powerful moment that we were there, and it was a happy moment while we had all these sad moments going on around us. And that's the Palestinian story. It's these little moments of hope in a sea of despair.
You're fighting to get a hospital into Gaza. Now, a lot of people might listen to that and think, how could that possibly happen? I mean, look what's happened to the hospitals that exist. They've been destroyed, ruined, targeted, systematically dismantled. Tell me, what's that about? What are you fighting for? What's the ask, I guess, and why is it so important?
Well, look, hospitals have been destroyed. There's no healthcare system in Gaza. You can't rebuild the healthcare system in Gaza, or, like this with the bombings and things like that. So what we've got is we've actually building the hospital outside of Gaza. It's medical caravans, and we drive it into Gaza. In Gaza, you put up the cement walls, you lay the sewerage and the waterworks. So what happens is these medical caravans get driven in. They're all solar panel powered. These medical caravans have state-of-the-art operating theaters, wards, pharmacies, pathology labs, has the ability to refill oxygen cylinders. It has kitchens. It has doctor's quarters. It has neonatal care unit. It has blood transfusion capabilities. It has immunization clinics. It has outpatient clinics. It's essentially a whole entire hospital on wheels. It gets put on the back of lorries, driven in and assembled like a jigsaw piece, and it's got running water, running sewage, electricity, state-of-the-art equipment, and wards, and all the other things that you need to run a hospital. Essentially, we're building a hospital outside and bringing it in.
Are you been campaigning to get support for this?
We've got a neonatal and maternity hospital ready. It's built, it's ready. It can be operational in 7 days.
Wow.
All we need is the government to get it in, and we have the grounds already set up, the walls, sewer, everything, so it just gets driven in. In 7 days, we could have a maternity and neonatal hospital in Gaza. The United Nations Population Fund, which deals with sexual and reproductive health, has said almost more than half of essential medications have run out for sexual and reproductive health. That means babies born prematurely don't have the necessary baby formula to stay alive, so they're dying.
And just to be clear, on the Genocide Convention, the definition of genocide includes is preventing the reproductive abilities of the population.
Yes. Yeah. This hospital, if it goes in, this can save those children. It has incubators, it has neonatal ICUs, it has birthing suites. That is ready to go right now. We have that ready. It's paid for, the funding's already there. So that's on the board and that's waiting to go in. Then what we've also got is we've also got the plans to build a pediatric hospital, similar format, similar setup. And we've got the infrastructure ready to build that hospital, and that can be done in a few months' time. And we're in the final stages of negotiations with the Minderoo Foundation to pay for all of that outright. So I'm not even asking governments for money. All I'm asking for is access to get these hospitals in. These hospitals are essential because, obviously, as you can see, the hospitals have been blown up and destroyed. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to do something different. It no longer can be left to NGOs to go into these partially destroyed hospitals with limited medical supplies and try and, essentially just a plaster over an open wound. What we need is we need governments to take over. We need these healthcare systems to be run almost at a state level, not Israeli and American state level where they funnel people into cages and mow them down while they're hungry and waiting for food. We need allies of Israel to come in and take over this. And that includes the European Union, it includes Britain, it includes Australia, it includes these major players like France to come in and deal with the logistics of this hospital, to help with the safety of this hospital. And it's an interest of the British government. The British government have been seen and been called to say that they've been complicit in this, in the crimes that are going on in Gaza. Well, this is a way to help Gaza, and it's something that is objective. It is a hospital. Children come in injured, they leave with smiling faces, and they leave saved and alive. And we have the ability to get that in right now. We have that maternity and neonatal hospital ready to go in right now. If we get that hospital in right now, we can start building our pediatric hospital. This can change everything. This changes the way we do healthcare in Gaza, and it changes the systematic destruction of Gaza, because these hospitals now are property of British, Australian, French, Canadian, whichever governments want to be involved in this, the Spanish, whoever. That's who it becomes, and then it becomes a diplomatic issue to bomb that. You can bomb Palestinian hospitals, but you can't bomb a British, Australian hospital, and that's what we're trying to do. And I'm not asking the governments to pay for it. We'll get all that sorted. We'll get the doctors in. All you need to do is you just need to give us security and access. That's it. And, it's a simple ask. The ICJ is very clear about what it wants governments to do. This is one of those things that is a practical solution.
So even though the International Court of Justice, the highest court on earth. Finally, you've just come back from Ireland. You met with the President of Ireland, for example. The Irish government has been very outspoken, not least given their own history because of the British. What do you say to people, I guess, watching, who often, I think, feel a bit helpless in terms of what they can do? They see the consequences every day of what, talk about complicity. Our own governments are complicit. They're arming Israel, and they facilitate one of the great crimes of our age, but they think to themselves, what can we do? What's the point? We haven't stopped this. What do you say to people who think they feel powerless, they feel impotent, they feel helpless, they feel just full of despair? Maybe they just can't bear. I totally understand people, having to watch these videos is not good for people's mental health. And you kind of think, well, I'm not doing it, I'll just switch off. Yeah. What do you say to people who just feel that kind of helplessness? Why is it important that people keep, whatever their platform, keep speaking out about Palestine and Gaza?
You know, we would have drones coming down in Gaza to making the sounds of crying children, right? Because it would lure people out to see these sounds and it would shoot them down. Psychological warfare. It's to break people down. It's to make them give up. And what we can't do is give up, because every day 100 people are being killed in Gaza. And I know people are tired and they're fatigued at what's going on in Gaza, and they feel like their voices aren't making a difference, but it is making a difference. And, you know, it's just the domino effect. The pieces are already beginning to fall. Everybody, you know, no matter how many battles Israeli army wins on the battlefield with however many actors, it's lost the war. It's not met its objectives. The objectives now of the Palestinian people have been met. Now there's more people calling for a Palestinian statehood than ever before. There's more people out on the streets campaigning for Palestine than ever before. So don't feel hope and despair. Don't feel hopeless. Don't feel despair, because actually, like I said, that battle with guns, yes, that's the IDF are winning that battle because they're killing so many people, and they might be ethnically cleansing people. But the other battle, we're winning it. We're winning it. Our voices are being heard, and things are beginning to change. So what we need, people, is to continue to show up and do what they can and not give up, because we are at a crucial point here. It's the end game for those people in Gaza. You know, they either starve to death there, they either get ethnically cleansed, or we get a free Gaza or a free Palestine. And that's why everybody right now, in the last quarter of this final solution, what's going on in Gaza, everyone needs to huddle in together, and we need to keep going forward.
Gosmo, it's been an absolute honour, searing, devastating stuff. And I think what you said, actually, a lot of it will stick with people who've watched this for the rest of their lives. I think it will be really, you know, again, it's so difficult, I think, for people to process the scale of this crime. And what you've done so beautifully is articulate that in a way that I think will shock people who think they can't be shocked anymore. And it is important, as you said, that people know they have to speak out, because this has been done in our name. And it's such an honour, and you should be so proud of what you've done. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. It's not often that I'm lost for words. I think that interview will stay with me for the rest of my life, and I think that's true with so many of you as well. It's so important we have to listen and we have to act, because this is one of the great crimes of our age, and it's being facilitated by our governments. We've got a duty, we've got a responsibility to speak out, because we're not suffering one of the great crimes of our age. Palestinian journalists have been killed in the biggest extermination of journalists in human history. They had to keep speaking out despite everything they faced. We don't face those risks, we need to speak out. So share this video, get the message out, act on it, do whatever we all can in the face of this crime. Press like, subscribe, leave your comments, really important, engage. But yeah, keep speaking out, never ever stop speaking out about Gaza.